Well, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Thank you so much for coming to the Blavatnik School of Government. My name is Calum Miller. I'm the Chief Operating Officer and Associate Dean here at the school. And it's our great pleasure not only to have you with us this evening, but particularly to have our two guests from the Bodossaki Foundation. The Blavatnik School is all about thinking about practical solutions to problems in the world and how we can help governments and the people who work for governments make better outcomes for their citizens. So when we learnt more about the work of the Bodossaki Foundation, and particularly the changes that the Foundation have undertaken over the last few years in response to the very significant challenges in Greece, we were really fascinated by that story. And so we're particularly delighted when two representatives of the Foundation agreed to come and tell us more about it this evening. So it's my real privilege to introduce Sotiris Laganopoulos, who's the Secretary of the Bodossaki Foundation, and Jennifer Clark, who's a Capacity Building Programme Coordinator. And in a short presentation now, they're going to share with us a little bit more about the work the Foundation's been doing, working particularly with groups in Greece and also with those who've been arriving in Greece as a part of the migration crisis in the Mediterranean. So I, for one, am very much looking forward to hearing more about it. There will be plenty of time afterwards for your questions, so please think about those as we listen first to Sotiris presenting about the work of the Foundation. You're very welcome.
Thank you, Calum. And thank you all on behalf of the Bodossaki Foundation for it is an honor for us to be here today and discuss this very important topic. The role of philanthropy, of course, has long been a crucial topic for us who have been working in the philanthropy sector. But as governments roll back the social support and aid programs, philanthropic foundations are taking an increasingly central role in the governance of some of society's greatest challenges. And so the role of philanthropy is today an issue that arguably affects us all. So a few words about the Bodossaki Foundation. How many of you have been to Greece? So I see the majority of you, that's nice. Bodossaki Foundation is one of the biggest foundations in Greece. It was established in 1972 by the late Bodossakis Athanasiadis. Bodossakis was an industrialist from Asia Minor who came in Greece in 1922 and started his businesses. He has been controlling the Greek economy for 35% of the Greek economy for more than 50 years. The foundation is currently active in four strategic pillars: education, health, protection of the environment, and strengthening of civil society. Education was a particular priority for our founder because he hadn't had the opportunity for a good education himself. So he wanted to help improve the access to education for all those that are in need. As you will know, the past few years have been exceptionally difficult for Greece, and this created an extremely challenging environment for foundations to operate. These challenges led us to fundamentally rethink our strategy and approach in order to ensure that we maximize our impact during these difficult times. It hasn't been easy, but looking back now on our experiences, we realize the changes we implemented have actually put us ahead of the curve within the philanthropic sector, as there is now a growing debate about how foundations can and should move beyond the traditional grant-making role. In this context, we are very happy to be able to share our experiences and lessons learned today with you. Greece has now been in a situation of economic and social crisis for around 8 years and certainly faces further difficult years ahead. So the term perma-crisis seems well justified. The recession that saw the country's GDP contract by about 25% does not have a parallel in modern peacetime history. But the many of problems experienced in Greece are also shared to a greater or lesser extent in other countries across Europe and beyond. Increasing inequality is one major challenge. Income inequality across OECD countries is now at its highest level for the past half century. the average income of the richest 10% of the population is about 9 times that of the poorest 10% across the OECD, up from 7 times 25 years ago. High public debt is problematic in Greece, of course, but also across many other countries, and has led to austerity measures reducing social spending and increasing taxation, with a disproportionate impact on society's most vulnerable groups. Linked to this, across Europe, the proportion of population at risk of poverty is persistently high, 17% across EU countries. In Greece, the figure is more than double than that of 36%. In fact, the most recent figures that we are hearing from the Greek Parliament suggest that half of the Greek population live in the risk of poverty. 36% of households experience energy poverty, and 22% of households suffer material deprivation. Also closely linked is the phenomenon of extremely high unemployment, currently at 21% of the population, of the general population, and 41% of all young people in Greece, according to Eurostat. Increased migration is a further major challenge across the EU, especially since 2015, with refugees fleeing war in Syria and elsewhere. In 2015-2016, more than 2.5 million people applied for asylum in the European Union, and of these, over 1 million people arrived in Greece. Arrivals are still continuing, and today around 54,000 asylum seekers remain in the country. To give you an insight into what these statistics means in human terms, I want to show you a short video we produced about one of the work of the NGOs working in the front line in the island of Lesbos about a year ago. This project was funded by the European Economic Area grants, which is mainly funded by Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. It is natural that these problems and issues that you have just seen have led to increased demands on funding from philanthropic foundations. At the Bodossaki Foundation, we have seen applications for funding increase by an average of 25% every year since 2009. At the same time, as is also the case of many other foundations, our funding capacity was negatively hit by the economic situation. In our case, since the beginning of the crisis, the foundation experienced a decrease of 40% in its net income due to unfavorable changes in taxation and the decrease in value of endowed real estate. Philanthropic foundations in Greece are taxed 30% on their income, and there is no precedent for such high taxation in any other European country. This challenge of having limited funding capacity at a time of increased social needs, in a sense, reflects in a microcosm the pressures placed on the philanthropic sector across Europe. On the other hand, the funding of philanthropic foundations is just a drop in the ocean compared to the size of national economies. Foundations' expenditure in Europe was measured to be an average only 0.45% of GDP in a 2015 study by the Fondation de France. Yet, at the same time, in much of Europe, as governments have reduced their funding, foundations have now become the most important source of funding for the voluntary sector. Just in December last year, research by the think tank New Philanthropy Capital and Lloyds Bank Foundation found that in the UK, the value of grants made by independent philanthropic foundations now exceeds the value of grants made by the government to the voluntary sector, totaling some £6.5 billion. This situation is something that is very familiar to us in Greece, where philanthropic foundations have for some years now been the main funders of the voluntary sector. These pressures of how to respond to higher needs with limited resources provoked some deep thinking within our foundation about what our role should be and how we should best leverage our limited resources. Following a period of critical reflection, the Bodossaki Foundation made a number of strategic changes in order to maximize its impact. And thanks to these changes, the total activities and grants associated with our foundation actually increased significantly, despite the decreased core funding. At the same time, I should add, we also stayed committed to addressing unequal access to education through providing scholarships to those with the greatest financial needs and through supporting the underfunded work of scientists in Greece. Following the strategic changes that we implemented, we are also very proud to have been recognized as an example of best practice internationally for supporting the effectiveness of grantees in the recent study by Lloyds and NPC. And in fact, we now provide training to other funders via the Ariadne Funders Network on how they can best support their grantees. So what has been our strategy for achieving more with less? I would like to briefly talk about 5 strategic changes that we made. The first one was the increased support for civil society. A first key change was to increase our focus on civil society, and this was added as a 4th strategic pillar to our work since 2012, in recognition of the potential of civil society, both to help to alleviate the effects of the crisis, but also, perhaps ever more importantly, to address some of the root causes of the crisis. One important activity in this context has been to fund primary education programs on volunteering and active citizenship to ensure that the next generation are most actively engaged in the voluntary sector. The second one was the increasing of our effectiveness. We took a number of steps to increase the effectiveness of our grant making. Our one step was to adopt a rigorous social needs assessment methodology to enable us to identify and respond to society's most pressing needs. Our program management unit conducts regular focus groups relating to the whole spectrum of social needs with representatives of civil society and other stakeholders. This enables us to map urgent needs as they emerge and informs our grant making. Through this process, for example, we identified that the transgender community in Greece was suffering from extreme social exclusion, as well as restrictions to their human rights regarding gender identity. We became the first foundation to provide core funding to support their crucial work, and in fact, we are one of the few foundations providing supports for human rights in Greece. We also identified a lack of appropriate accommodation for unaccompanied refugee children, a crisis within a crisis, and as a result, we funded activities to address this issue, which I will say more about in a moment. Other important steps were to introduce a rigorous system of monitoring and evaluation of funded projects, and the use of the results-based management framework to monitor and measure the impact of our grant making, and therefore also to be able to communicate this impact more effectively. We also gained an ISO to ensure the highest quality of our management processes. The third one, I would say, one of the important aspects of our strategy was our initiative to become fund operator of the EA grants, for third-party grants actually. Through a competitive process, we were selected as a fund operator for the EA grants NGO program for Greece. And in this capacity, we managed a total grant of 7.3 million euros, donated by Norway, Liechtenstein, and Iceland, resulting in 75 projects implemented across Greece with a total of 200,005 beneficiaries. We also recently took on a fund operator role for the social and environmental investment program of the Trans-Adriatic Pipeline, a project that transmits gas from Azerbaijan to Europe, which actually includes the management of programs amounted up to now 2 million, with the possibility to increase in around 32 million euros in total. These projects are implemented in 29 municipalities across Greece. A further way to increase our funding capacity was actually to actively fundraise to address some of the identified urgent needs. One example of this is our Safe Home thematic fund, which raised 485,000 euros to support unaccompanied refugee children. Through this fund, 6 specialist NGOs were supported. 2 shelters for unaccompanied refugee children were built from scratch, and 6 other existing ones were supported. Their operation was supported, and as a result, 321 refugee children were taken out from the street and were placed in proper shelters. Our current fundraising effort focuses on supporting the sustainable livelihoods of rural Greek farmers by supporting them to develop innovative agro-food products, thus also helping the wider Greek economy. I would like to show you, again, a very short TV clip we produced as part of the unaccompanied refugee children fundraising campaign. the fourth step that we have taken to maximize the impact of our work is the advocacy role for the Foundation on behalf of the sector that was adopted by the Foundation. Our Foundation has been playing an important role in advocacy efforts for improving the legal framework for the voluntary sector in Greece. As you may know, there is no legal framework operating the existence of the operation of NGOs in Greece, but also the volunteerism. We contributed to a draft law to improve the transparency of the sector, which reached consultation stage in the Greek Parliament. The initiative was stalled for a while, but it is now making progress again, together with Transparency International, and we hope that these efforts are going to produce results soon. The fifth aspect of our strategy is was actually to scale up our impact. In order to scale up our impact, was to extend our support to include offering non-financial support to the voluntary sector, what we call actually capacity building of the sector. So my colleague Jennifer will tell you a bit more about it.
Thanks, Otili. We were really aware that for the effectiveness of philanthropic funding, it's important to have organisations on the ground who are able to absorb that funding and use it to implement effective and sustainable activities. In Greece, though, the voluntary sector is really still in a phase of development. There are only a handful of large professionalised organisations, and the vast majority of organisations are very small, informal, they're often quite new, established in response to the crisis. And if they're to scale up their activities beyond the very local level, we were aware that they needed support to gain expertise and skills in areas like financial management, project management, communications, and so on. The sector is also really hampered by a lack of funding in Greece. As you can imagine, the crisis has really hit charitable giving. That's really dropped. And so organisations really need help in developing their fundraising skills and also in developing income-generating activities. But I think probably what has held the sector back most is a lack of public trust in the sector. You might be aware public trust tends to be quite low in Greece. That's a characteristic. So in surveys like the European Social Survey that measure trust levels, Greece tends to be ranked near the bottom. But in particular, in the case of the voluntary sector, unfortunately, as a result of lax controls of state funds during past decades, there were a series of scandals that really hit the public trust in the sector. So taking all this into account, it was clear to us that apart from the financial support that we were already offering as a foundation, many organisations would really benefit from non-financial capacity building support. Now, I know in the UK there's a really well-developed second-tier infrastructure for the voluntary sector, and there are umbrella organisations that can offer this kind of support to small organisations. In Greece, this second tier doesn't really exist. In fact, we identified there was a real lack of capacity building, and so we decided to start offering that ourselves. The NGO, the EEA grants programme that Sotiris mentioned briefly before, gave us the opportunity to design and implement a capacity building programme for grantees for the very first time. And in fact, that turned out to be the most comprehensive capacity building programme implemented in Greece to date. Just to give you a very quick overview, we developed 120 hours of training activities. We actually implemented more than 400 hours of training in total. We really encouraged good practice sharing between different organisations, and we brought on board mentors from the private sector who offered, on a voluntary basis, over 200 hours of mentoring to the organisations we were supporting. Now, we were pleased, obviously, that we received very positive feedback from the organisations involved, but what for us was the most important thing was that almost all of the organisations who had taken part in these activities demonstrated improved capacity, they improved the way that they were managing their organisations by the end of the activities. And we knew that, we could measure that because we actually have an organisational capacity mapping tool which allows us to measure over 30 different aspects of organisational development, both before and after the capacity building activities. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of the kind of changes that we were seeing within the organisations, a lot of organisations improved their management procedures, whether in terms of strategic planning or in terms of financial planning. Many were improving the way that they were working with volunteers. Actually, one of the kind of silver linings to the crisis is that there's been an upturn in volunteering, but organisations don't always have the skills automatically to be able to use those volunteers, well and efficiently. So that was an important area. Also very important, particularly taking into account those trust issues, were the increase in transparency and accountability, which were achieved by organisations improving their online data, by introducing financial controls, and by improving their complaints procedures. And this was quite an interesting one, because when we were asking organisations at the beginning of the programme if they had a complaints procedure, that was really an issue that very few organisations even understood the question, what was a complaints procedure? And I think, this whole really unfortunate incident with Oxfam has really shown how important it is for organisations to have procedures so that if and when something does go wrong, they've got a procedure for how to deal with that. So that was something that was really important. And also, many organisations managed to improve their financial sustainability, which, taking into account the financial, the economic context, was really impressive. And they did that either by finding new sources of funding, by diversifying their funding base, or by expanding their fundraising team. So these results were so positive that we actually decided we wanted to continue this capacity building work on a long-term sustainable basis. And just over a year ago, we launched Social Dynamo, which is a capacity building hub in Athens. At Social Dynamo, we offer a co-working space. We offer a wide range of training activities. We offer mentoring and consultancy and network opportunities, all at free of charge to voluntary organisations. It's been really important to us, precisely because we want it to be sustainable, to take a really collaborative approach in this. Our main partners on the project are the Municipality of Athens. They host the physical space, which of course keeps the costs manageable for us. But it also offers a whole range of synergies with different services that the municipality has to offer. And they also share our kind of aims and vision of strengthening civil society. So that's been a really important partnership. We've also developed collaborations with over 20 different organisations, with more than 40 trainers. And our mentoring team has now grown to over 60 highly skilled individuals, mainly from the private sector, also from some of the larger NGOs. ActionAid has supported us with some of its senior staff members as mentors and consultants. So after just a year now, exactly a year, we're proud that we've already managed to train over 170 organisations. We won our first award, which was fantastic. But also it's really important that we're already now providing capacity building services to 7 other donors. So we're beginning to mainstream the concept of providing non-financial support to the philanthropic sector in Greece. So we'd like to conclude the presentation by reflecting on some of the lessons that we've learned through adapting our strategy to rise to the challenges that we faced, and how they might be relevant to the future of the philanthropic sector more generally. So making sure that our limited financial capital is employed to maximum effect through rigorous needs assessment and results-based management is one obvious lesson learnt. But beyond this, we've realised that as a foundation, we also have other types of capital at our disposal, which until recently we were not putting to full use. As a foundation, we have significant human capital in the form of the skills and expertise of our staff, which we're now more proactive in sharing. Our staff's in-depth knowledge of social needs, the characteristics of the Greek voluntary sector, and of effective grant making are all valuable, and we now leverage these knowledge and skills to play a management role in the funds of third parties, as Sotiris mentioned. Our human capital resources also include skills and knowledge that's extremely valuable to the voluntary sector organisations themselves. For example, expertise in how to write project proposals, how to maintain a good relationship with a donor, how to manage the financial reporting of a project, how to communicate activities effectively. Through our capacity building work, we now make this expertise directly available to voluntary organisations through involving our staff in the training and consultancy sessions that we offer. As a foundation, we also have significant social capital in the form of wide contacts and networks, and we now leverage these contacts and networks much more effectively and strategically, whether to engage them in contributing their funding, their skills, as is the case of our pro bono mentors, or their physical space, as in the case of the municipality. We're also now using these contacts and our influence more strategic also to advocate for change on behalf of the sector through our advocacy work. But we've realised that perhaps the most important social capital resource that we have at our disposal as a philanthropic foundation, and the resource that has in fact been a prerequisite for all the strategic changes and achievements that we've described, has been our sound reputation and our credibility within the sector. Given the extremely low trust levels in the sector more generally that I mentioned previously, it was extremely encouraging for us to learn in a new survey that indicates that 7 out of 10 respondents in Greece declare that they have considerable or high levels of trust in philanthropic foundations. In fact, these are the highest levels of trust declared for any type of institution by quite a high margin. And we just learnt this a couple of days ago. In fact, you're the first people to hear this. So it also seems like trust in NGOs is beginning to recover, which is also encouraging. In an era in which public confidence in the voluntary sector is fragile, these encouraging results show that philanthropic foundations have the possibility and the responsibility to act as beacons for the credibility for the voluntary sector. We must ensure that we safeguard this positive reputation and that we use our influence, of course, to blow a whistle in the occasional instance that we may become aware of malpractice within the sector, but also to vouch for the credibility and to help promote the work of the countless excellent voluntary organisations that we work with day after day, who often, in very difficult circumstances, are achieving small miracles through their work. Today, there are over 130,000 philanthropic foundations in Europe with an annual expenditure of over 54 billion euros, and these are figures coming from the Fondation de France survey that Sotiris mentioned earlier. Being now the biggest donors to the voluntary sector in some countries is a huge responsibility for the philanthropic sector. But given that governments do not seem likely to increase their support for the voluntary sector at any time in the near future, this is, I think, a new normal that we better get used to and a challenge that we need to rise to. In order to do this, we would argue the philanthropic sector can and should lever all the resources that it has at its disposal. Philanthropy cannot and should not, of course, be a substitute for adequate and fair state social provision. But when needs are high, philanthropic foundations do have a role to ensure that their resources are put to maximum effect. This may at times include working in collaboration with the state, and it may at times include lobbying governments for change. Now, the image chosen to advertise this event today was selected for a reason. It's in fact a refugee boy participating in an activity at one of the shelters that we supported. But we chose it to represent the fact that although as philanthropic foundations we may only be able to sow a few small seeds, if we choose these seeds wisely and strategically, and if we use all the available tools we have to cultivate them, And if we engage others to help us nurture them, then we can ensure that our efforts will bear maximum fruit. Our experience at the Bodossaki Foundation has shown that the challenges that we face can also be opportunities to increase our impact. We hope, therefore, that our experiences and lessons learned have provided some food for thought about some of the potential future directions for philanthropy. Thank you.
Brilliant. Teacher, if I can have a seat. Well, thank you very much to our speakers for a really clear and, I think, inspirational presentation. We're going to move to some questions now, so we're just going to take a seat here at the front so that we're better able to respond to any questions that you might have. And if I could ask anyone asking a question, if you could just briefly introduce yourself and say if you have an institutional affiliation, just so our speakers understand where you're coming from with your questions. So who would like to kick us off? Over here. There's a microphone just coming to you. If you just wait 1 sec, that'd be great.
Hello, my name is Alexandra, and I'm an MPP student at the Blavatnik School of Government here. And I would like to thank you so much for your visit. It is for me particularly personally important because before joining the school, I served as a rescue diver on the Aegean Sea on Lesbos, and I worked in Moria. So I served at night between Turkey and Greece trying to secure the refugee boats during the winter of 2015-2016. And what I've observed every time I returned to Greece and I saw the camps and the situation on the sea is that at some point the EU and the Turkey, while signing the EU-Turkey agreement, they came up with closing of the Eastern Mediterranean route, of the closing the sea, putting NATO ships that would return the boats back to Turkey, arresting the volunteers, arresting many of my friends who served along with me on the sea. And the refugees could not go to Athens from the islands. They could not move on. So the hope that I've seen at the beginning, the gratitude, the happiness, the joy that I saw in the eyes of the people that we were pulled out of the water soon turned into desperation, into suicidal thoughts. And currently the camps are overcrowded. They're in far, far worse conditions than I saw 2 years ago when I joined FAST. So my question to you is, how do we navigate as the NGO sector? How do we navigate the change? How do we navigate the new psychological challenges really that are there with people in the camps when they turned from the transition camps to the detention centers and to informal prisons really? Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. Did anyone else want to ask a question on the refugee issue, just so we could gather a couple on that topic before asking our guests to respond? If not, Sotiris, do you want to?
Can I speak? Yes. Okay. So it is true that the situation is deteriorated over the last years, and actually the conditions in the camps where the refugees are hosted at the moment are not the best. What we have seen is that lately the NGOs are providing support actually psychological support to their staff, and in order to tackle situations like those that you described before. So there is an increased, and we have already done a seminar for that, for thematic capacity building to the NGO sector on how to help their employees in order to tackle very stressful situations. There were some experts from US universities, but also from the universities from all over Europe, that they came to Athens or in the island of Lesbos, and they provided support to the staff working in the NGO sector. And the other thing that I have seen lately is that the NGOs are trying not to leave the same employees for an extended period of time in working in the field, especially in the island of Lesbos and Chios. So there is a shift in the employees in order to, help them to support them psychologically.
Should I just briefly add to that? Yeah, it's a huge problem, and I don't think there's a very easy issue. And we have to remember that this was a very new and sudden situation on the islands, and there were very few, only a handful of organisations that had prior experience to dealing with these issues. So one important part of our work is developing the capacity of the kind of small organisations, the the initiatives that have developed on the islands. We've got an ongoing project which is bringing in expertise from the Netherlands, actually, to help strengthen the organisations and help them to become more organised, and also help them to collaborate better between them, because to get a kind of coherent response, it's very important for the small initiatives to link up between each other. So these are some of the initiatives that we've been supporting, but there's a lot of work to do. It's a really difficult issue.
Thanks so much. Other questions? Well, maybe just while others are thinking, I wondered if I could just probe a little bit into what you presented us with on the finances of the foundation. You described to us a big strategic shift in terms of reorientating some of the focus of the foundation's work, but also explained to us that the expenditure had gone up quite significantly at a time when the revenue was coming down. Without being too much of an accountant about it, I wonder if you could just explain to us to what extent that was driven by an increase in your own revenues, because you talked about managing grants for others and other ways in which you were growing the activities of the organisation, and to what extent there was a decision taken essentially to spend down more of the underlying assets of the foundation in the face of the crisis that the society was facing.
I think that it was a combination of both. What we realized was that, especially in 2010 and 11, the need was increasing. So we had to do something in order to help the society. And in order to maintain our granting capacity, but also tackle these urgent needs, we had to find some money from, actually from different sources. The way that the endowment of the foundation it is invested, it wasn't very easy to change it and see a big difference in increase from the one day to the other. So we had to identify other ways to do it, and managing funds from others was one of the most successful, I would say, ways to achieve this initiative. And I would say that we have a big asset, which was actually the reputation of the foundation. So we used our reputation and the transparent procedures that we implement. So we actually sell this asset to other people that wanted to support projects in Greece, and this is what actually we did.
Thank you very much. Yes. Please. There's a microphone just coming. If you just wait 1 second.
Contact the expatriate Greeks who live abroad. My sister's lived for 50 years in Greece, but has had to leave because she couldn't afford to stay there when they put her pension down a further 20%. So she's now back in Britain. But her landlady, who used to be a wealthy woman in Athens, has tried to double the rent where she was. She's living in New York with a pot of money. Now, she's the sort of person who should be contacted and explained. And do you have any method at all for doing that?
Yeah, what we are actually, shall I reply? Yes. What we are actually doing is we are using the Greek diaspora through organized channels to help them implement projects in Greece. For example, you mentioned the US. We have contacted a new initiative which is called the Hellenic Initiative, and it's actually it is called the Hellenic Initiative, and it is actually an initiative of all the wealthy Greek Americans that are trying to support Greece. We are partnering with them, but also we are partnering with the local organizations of the Greek diaspora from various cities, mainly the US or some in Europe. I'm insisting in the US because in the US they are the more organized Greek diaspora. And it is worth mentioning that the majority of the funding that we got for the Safe Home, it comes from Greeks from the diaspora. Yes.
Thank you. Just behind you, if you could just pass the microphone back, that'd be great.
Thank you for a great presentation. My name is Andrea. I work here at the school. So you've mentioned low trust in government and public services more generally. So I was just wondering whether if you could say a few words about your relationship with government and how you manage that. Do you associate your foundation quite closely with government priorities, for example, or do you try to be perceived as, independent organization?
We try to keep, as we mentioned before, we have set up a methodology in order to identify the social needs. So we organized consultation meetings with all the stakeholders playing a role in the thematic area that we investigate. So the state cannot be absent, from these consultation meetings. We always discuss with them. We try to keep a distance because we are independent from the government, but it is not possible to implement philanthropic projects in Greece when this is not in cooperation with the government. And as we said, the role of the foundations is not actually to replace the government, it's actually to supplement the government. That's why we are always, trying to have a proper relations with them.
Yeah, I think we try to be close enough to understand what their needs are, so we know that where we can collaborate, but also have a critical distance. So if we need to play more of an advocacy role, then we can also do that.
There's a question just here.
How do you balance the impact measurement structures that you have and ask of your grantees and the kind of resource intensiveness of impact reporting, especially for smaller NGOs who are, responding to emergencies in certain situations and that might not have a lot of those resources?
Great. So if anyone didn't catch that, the question was how do you balance the measurement mechanisms and the impact that might have on smaller organisations who have to respond to your requirements, especially if they have lower capacity themselves?
Yeah, no, that's a good point, and especially because impact measurement is something that's actually quite new to the system in Greece. Very few organisations were using any form of metrics up to maybe 3 or 4 years ago. I think it's really been quite new. And we do take that into account. We don't want to overburden organisations with kind of the red tape when they want to be getting on with the activities. But on the other hand, organisations that are able to gather some data also are then able to communicate their own impact, not only to us, but to other potential donors as well. So it's usually an investment that pays back for them as well. So capacity building around that whole kind of impact assessment has been quite an important area of work. But yeah, we try and not overburden organisations depending on their level and capacity.
I wonder if I might abuse my position as chair just to ask a question which I think links the last two about accountability. So there's a question there about the government role, and you've been very clear that you see your role as supplementing what government does. Government has a very direct form of accountability, in democracies at least through the ballot box. But then you've talked about those who receive your grants having a form of accountability through impact measurement to you. How do you think about the accountability of the foundation? You're a wealthy organisation able to influence the expenditure of others by leveraging, as you talked about, how they spend money. How, for you, do you think about the concept of accountability? And I suppose the simplest way of putting it is, to whom are you accountable?
You can discuss also,
yeah, no,
but
I mean,
what we usually do is we are trying to meet the European and international standards in terms of accountability. As I mentioned, we gained the ISO for our management and control systems. What we are suggesting to the NGOs in terms of transparency and accountability, we are trying to do it ourselves as well. We provide, we advertise our management systems and also our financial statements and everything. So maybe you can add if you want.
Yeah. And I think, this idea of credibility is not something that you can ever take for granted. So I think it's really important to us to have a very kind of open communication with stakeholders, whether that's the public, whether that's the media, the government. I think that's been an important part of our role, and I don't think we could have achieved what we have done if we weren't kind of considered an open and accountable foundation.
Thank you. Further questions? Please, right in the centre. You have microphones coming to you from both directions, so take whichever one you prefer. There you go. If you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself, that'd be great.
if I understood what you said correctly, the foundation has scaled up its activities to include refugees and migrants and people coming. I know from different situations that I've observed that huge amounts of people coming in somewhere causes tension. Has the foundation experienced any unfortunate attitudes among the people who it would normally support? Has there been any kind of, you know what I mean, kind of pushback from your normal constituents who in some situations might consider that as kind of competition for the funding?
Yep.
I think this is something that we may face in the future, actually, that the overwhelming response in Greece was very positive. There was a very positive public response, a huge outpouring of support for refugees. And I think the big difference between Greece and, say, the UK is in Greece, people know that actually the vast majority of the refugees aren't going to be staying there. It's just a transit point, and they're going to be moving on. So I think possibly it doesn't stoke the same kind of immediate tensions as it does somewhere in the UK, which is more of a destination country. Having said that, now there's gradually a shift towards the integration of refugees, because the 50 or so thousand asylum seekers who are still there aren't going to be going anywhere very, very soon. So the government is beginning to actually, for the first time, look more in a long-term way towards integration strategies. A lot of the refugee children started schools in September, and there were a few incidents, although again the vast majority of cases were very, very positive, I think. So I think these are going to be issues that we're possibly going to be seeing as people are kind of settling down and beginning to integrate. So it's something that's on our radar. And again, that's been a topic for this capacity building program of organisations working with refugees, is how they support integration.
Yeah. Additionally, the majority of the foundations in Greece didn't stop funding the general population, I would say, of Greece. They continue their initiatives, but they added new initiatives targeted directly to refugees. For example, there are many foundations actually at the moment supporting the local communities that have all these years managed the huge burden of the refugee crisis. So, you know, with this policy, I think a balance is kept between these, two big problems.
Perhaps I could build on that. I mean, I think you've talked to us a bit about how you organise the finances of the organisation. And I think in your, if I may say, your very calm and measured presentation, you may have glossed over the fact that the foundation has really made quite a radical shift in a number of directions over this period, both in terms of the target groups who you're supporting and also in terms of your own management and the revenues that you've been working with. Against that, and against the very clear message that you see the trust in philanthropy as an important, or if not the most important asset, I wonder if you could be open with us and tell us about the risks you think you're running. Which are the risks that you worry most about, either reputational, financial, or programmatic? And how are you seeking to manage that in order to protect the trust capital that's so important to the ongoing impact of the foundation?
I mean, when you are funding projects of organizations that you don't know, there's always a risk that this funding might end up not mismanaged. But we have set up a very close monitoring system that does not allow, that actually is trying to prevent any cases of money mismanagement. Our team is following closely the implementation of all the projects, and although we are not obliged to do so, we are when we are managing funds from other organizations, we also audit 100% of the financial papers that the beneficiaries are submitting to us. This is actually it's heavier for the foundation to manage that, but it is a strategic decision of the board in order to be sure that everything is properly managed. Other risks, I would mention that the needs in Greece increased so much that our work is not enough. But I'm sure we will find ways to tackle similar risks.
And in a way, the whole offering of non-financial support is a risk mitigation strategy, because there's lots of organisations who aren't quite ready to be able to take on a financial grant. But by working with them through capacity building, we get to know them a lot better, and then we're a lot better able to assess if and when they're then ready to kind of take the responsibility of a financial grant. So that's helped us as well as a risk management strategy, I think.
Yeah, thank you.
And them, because no one wants a project to go wrong. So.
Great, thank you. Are there any final questions from members of the audience? Brilliant. Well, in that case, on your behalf, I would like to thank Sotirios and Jennifer so much for your time this evening. I think we've heard from you not only about a fascinating insight into some of the challenges that Greek society has faced over the last period, but also the way in which you and your leadership roles in the Foundation have helped that organisation respond to them in a really creative, imaginative, and I might say courageous way. So thank you for sharing it with us, and thank you very much, and good luck in your ongoing work.
Thank you very much.